could you begin by introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Mark Fancher. I'm the staff attorney for the Racial Justice Project for the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan.
hmm So, tell me again how you are connected with water in Detroit, and all of the stuff that is going on right now here in the city as far as water affordability and security.
Well, my work has focused pretty much exclusively on the issue of mass water shutoffs. This has been a problem in Detroit for at least 10 years, probably closer to 15 or 16. And the ACLU of Michigan became part of a coalition of legal organizations and private attorneys who were looking to challenge the practice by the local utility of shutting off thousands of people's water service and using litigation to do that and other forms of advocacy. And I've been a part of that effort.
hmm So, when you said at least 10 years, if not 15 or 16, that actually surprised me as well, because most people who are even aware of the water shutoffs tend to think about this happening from 2014 or so. So can you maybe situate all of this historically for us in terms of what kind of mass water shutoffs are we talking about 15 or 16 years ago, and how have they sort of played out in the years since then?
Well, it's been a standard method for collection used by Detroit Water and Sewage Department. And the numbers have varied over the years, sometimes smaller numbers, sometimes larger numbers, but in more recent years, it's been in the tens of thousands. And it is basically the approach that they use to deal with those customers who have an arrearage, an unpaid balance on their water bills. The policies and the rules of DWSD include a number of different procedures and steps that can be taken before you reach the ultimate collection remedy of shutting off water. But historically, in many cases, those procedures have not been followed. And there have been shutoffs which, by any reasonable judgment, would be regarded as premature.
Is Detroit unique in terms of these water shutoffs, or are we seeing water shutoffs in other towns and cities of Michigan as well?
In Michigan, it might be fairly unique. Nationally, there are other cities that have done this, but the trend among cities that are pursuing a more enlightened approach, and I think that probably includes most major cities, is to adopt an approach that ensures that all of the city's residents have reasonable access to water. It's a necessity. It's really a human right. And the idea of just depriving people of water is in the minds of most reasonable people unthinkable. And in order to address it, most cities have adopted a water affordability plan, which frequently indexes the cost of water to the actual income of the household. And that ensures a number of things. It ensures that, number one, that water is affordable and that a family is able to be reasonably assured that they're going to have continuing water service. But it also benefits the provider, because in the absence of something like that, there are families, households, that go for at least some period of time where they're continuing to receive water, but they're not paying anything for it. This ensures a continuing stream of income. It may not, for the utility, it may not be market rate that's being paid, but it is something that's being paid, and it relieves the burden that in the city of Detroit is shifted to those consumers who are paying market rate and who are picking up the slack for those who are not paying anything. So it just makes good sense. But Detroit has stubbornly refused to give any serious thought to a water affordability plan over the course of more than a decade.
So, playing devil's advocate here, for a lot of people, when they hear about water shutoffs to people who do not pay their water bills, that is the overwhelming frame that they listen to. You haven't paid your bills, you don't get water. It's disconnected. Often the frame is do not pay their water bills as opposed to cannot pay their water bills, right? So for a lot of these people who tend to hear about, the water shutoffs and just randomly like this, and they tend to have this kind of a mindset, they might be thinking, well, you can't pay your water bills, you don't get access to water. Why is that an ACLU problem? Why is that a racial justice problem? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. It's unfortunate that in not just Detroit and Michigan, but throughout the country, that there is an ongoing racial and class bias against people who are people of color and people who are poor. And many times people begin their analysis with a presumption that these are people who are deadbeats, these are people who are lazy, these are people who make bad choices. That's where they begin. And they never get to the point of looking at the actual circumstances of the people who are involved. If you actually look at the people who are involved, you'll find that these are not people who are making choices not to pay. These are people who just cannot pay. Many of them are elderly, living on fixed incomes. Many of them are ill. They are unable to hold and maintain gainful employment. Many of them are disabled, and they too are living on fixed incomes and are not able to pay market rate for water. There are people who are recently unemployed, who have been paying for quite some time, but who suddenly find themselves unable to pay. There are people who have recently moved into properties that were occupied by others before them, and these are people who left behind arrearages. These are people who left debts that these new residents are inheriting in the minds of DWSD, the water provider. There are people who have been the victims of the incompetence of the utility. These are people who have water bills for water that they never received. There are instances where the utility has gone and made guesses about how much water has been used because of the absence of a water meter. There are people there who have been the victims of just bad record keeping by the utility. And they're being asked to pay extraordinary amounts of money for water that they never received. So there are many, many explanations for why people are not receiving water. But the common refrain among those who oppose these people is that they have made choices to buy flat screen TVs or to buy expensive smartphones and things like that rather than using the money to pay for water. And in most cases, that's just not true.
Thank you for helping us bust those myths, I guess. How did you get involved with this work, especially related to water shutoffs? Was this something that you had been pursuing or examining for a long while? Was it something that community members or partners brought to you? Can you maybe go a little bit personal and talk a little bit about how you sort of entered this space?
Well, I don't have a real interesting or exciting story about that. It was something that was more or less assigned. I did have a personal interest in it, passion for it once I was assigned to it, but there was nothing unique or interesting about how it came to be part of the work that I do.
So, when you talk about how you had a personal interest in it, when I guess the mass water shutoffs were really sort of making the headlines, they started making headlines around the United Nations special rapporteur visit. What was going through your head at that point? Were you still working on this project at that point in time?
Yeah,
or?
As an organization, we were working on it during that phase, it is one of any number of problems that impact low-income people that concerns me a great deal, and this was no different.
So, tell us a little bit about the most recent coalition that you joined with, and then you filed a request with the state government. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, this is actually, one of the diminishing options that we have available to us to address the water shutoffs problem. We have tried litigation without success. We've tried individual advocacy with only limited impact. And so we have been left to approach the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and to request that they declare a public health emergency. We've submitted to them a petition that explains that in addition to the scientific studies which show that there is a high risk of mass outbreaks and epidemics of communicable diseases in communities where there have been water shutoffs, that in addition there are many practical threats to the health and safety of people in communities that don't have it. To give just a few of the examples that we cited, when a family does not have water service, then that means that a mother is unable to prepare formula for her baby. And that has obvious consequences for the health of that child. There are instances when there are people who, in desperation, will set out buckets and barrels in order to collect rainwater that they can use not only for cleaning but for drinking. And that water is very often contaminated by environmental contaminants, and it impacts their health when they drink that. There is a derivative adverse health effect for people who suffer from hypertension or high blood pressure and things because of the stress that goes with not having water available to them. There are people who are diabetics who have to have a certain diet that they have in order to ensure their continuing health, and without water it's very often difficult, if not impossible, for them to prepare the kinds of meals that they need in order to ensure their health. So there are a lot of practical health consequences to not having it. Not to mention the others that are connected to just not being able to maintain personal cleanliness and hygiene. So those are the things that we've asked them to consider as they look at the prospect of declaring a public health emergency.
So this request, I know, was made in collaboration with a number of other groups as well. Can you maybe talk us through who some of these groups are? When you made this request also, was it submitted to the state's Department of Health and Human Services? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
It was. And the real hero, at least in terms of the legal work in this entire effort, not just with respect to our petition, but ongoing, is really a legendary civil rights lawyer named Alice Jennings, who has been a stalwart champion and really has provided a lot of the creative energy and the demonstrated initiative in getting a lot of this started. And so she is primary individual who's part of the group that has filed the petition. In addition, we have Jerome Goldberg, who is representing a grassroots advocacy organization that he works with. We have the Maurice and Jane Sugar Law Center for Economic and Social Justice, which is involved. The Great Lakes Legal Center is involved. Anthony Adams, private lawyer who has a history of work with the city, is involved as well. There are several other individuals and organizations who have participated in this effort.
What was I guess the thinking behind this petition? Because you talked about how in the past you have, and I think you mentioned both litigation as well as individual advocacy movements. So what was the thinking behind this broader collaborative petition? Was it showing greater numbers? Was it showing broader applicability across different areas? What makes you think that this might be a little bit more successful or effective, I guess, compared to measures in the past?
Well, two points. One is that from the beginning, this has been a coalition effort. During the litigation, a number of the individuals and organizations that I just mentioned were part of the litigation effort as well. They were part of the pre-litigation work that was done, in terms of bringing the UN to town and a lot of other things that have been going on. So that's been an ongoing thing. I don't know that we necessarily expect that this will be any more effective than other things that we have done. But we're, to be frank, running out of options. And it is one of the few remaining ones that we have. It's our continuing hope that at some point there will be, sane minds that look at this and, people who have at least an ounce of humanitarian concern, who will finally see what's happening and respond to the requests that we're making for some type of, helpful intervention in this problem.
Have you been surprised by how long this has continued?
Yes and no. I think that the claims that were asserted in the litigation were very strong, and it was my hope that once this issue was elevated, taken out of the realm of local political kinds of individuals and interests and that kind of thing, and found its way into the court, that there would be a more objective kind of assessment of the problem, and that relief might be found there. But it was not the case. We strongly disagree with the rulings by the courts, and we've been left to re-enter the political realm. Once it's there, then no, it doesn't surprise me, because I think there are a number of agendas at work that work against what we're hoping to accomplish.
Can you go over, or maybe briefly recount, at least some of the major litigations that you talked about that you may have had high hopes for, but eventually were not effective?
Yeah, we filed one major class action in U.S. District Court, the federal court, on behalf of water customers who have had their service discontinued. And that lawsuit asserted a number of different claims, including public health emergency, which is the subject of the recent petition. But the two primary claims revolved around due process and equal protection. Due process is just a fancy way of saying that when you have an important interest and the state or the government is seeking to deprive you of that, whether it's your life, your liberty, or your property, that you have the right under the Constitution to come in and to challenge that and to be heard, to say, no, you cannot and should not deprive me of this for these reasons. and to have someone to make a reasonable and fair decision about whether in fact it should be taken. Our claim against DWSD is that they had a series of procedures that were supposed to have been followed before they turned off anybody's water, and that we were able to cite any number of examples of where they ignored those requirements, they ignored those procedures altogether, and that in some cases people lost their water without any warning at all, without any notice at all, depriving them of due process. So that was one of our strong claims. Okay. The other one was equal protection, which makes reference to cases where there's discrimination. We asserted that whether a recipient of water is a business or whether it's a person who's a resident, that they're both water customers. They're similarly situated. Their relationship with the utility is basically the same. Utility provides them with water, they're obligated to pay for the water. And that in that respect, they're the same. And that it's discrimination if one class of water customers is treated differently from the other class. We said that commercial water customers were being treated differently from the residential customers. We were able to provide the court with a list of many names of large companies, large corporations that owed sometimes 6 and 7 figures in unpaid water debts. And not one of those companies had their water service terminated, not one. Whereas, where you have residential customers who sometimes owed as little as $100, that they could lose their water service summarily. And we said that kind of arbitrary distinction, that discrimination, was something that violated the Constitution. The courts did not find merit in those claims. At the outset, they dismissed the lawsuit altogether because at the time that we filed it, the city of Detroit was in bankruptcy. And there is a provision of the bankruptcy code, section 904, that provides that when a city is in bankruptcy, that the court is prohibited from doing anything that is going to interfere with the assets or the decisions made or the decision-making authority of the bankrupt party. And that by asking for the relief that we sought in this lawsuit, they said that it would violate section 904. And for that reason, they said that the court did not have jurisdiction to deal with it. But in the trial court, or the trial level court, the judge said that because we were dealing with constitutional claims, at least with respect to equal protection and due process, that those are rooted in the Constitution, and that section 904 was a creation of Congress, and that the Constitution superseded any congressional enactment, and therefore those claims could proceed, notwithstanding section 904. But even though he got our hopes up when he first said that, he went on to say that even looking at these claims and the merits of them, that he didn't find them to have validity. He said that with respect to the due process claim, he said that there were any number of new procedures that the city had come up with in the interim, and that he was obligated to look at what they were doing at this moment, rather than what had gone on before, and that they offered some promise. With respect to the equal protection claim, he relied on a requirement that when you have classes, or a class that you're complaining about, where it's not what's called a suspect class, a racial minority or something like that, that great deference is given to the government decision maker about this, any kind of different treatment that they choose to make. And that if they can show that the decision that they're making is reasonably related, rationally related to the objective that they're trying to achieve, then the court's not going to interfere with that. And so even though there was no evidence in the record of this, the court speculated and said that maybe it's more difficult to turn off the water of a business than it is for residents. And so if that's the case, then that's good enough for the court, and he's not going to, second guess the utility on decisions it's making about different treatment. We appealed that, and when we went up to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, they in some ways echoed what was said below about due process, and they said that the practices that we complained about were outdated, that they had to look at what was currently in place in terms of the procedures that were being followed, and they had evidence that there were all kinds of new things that were being done, and so that they were not going to get into that. And as to equal protection, they repeated what was said below, but also said that when you're dealing with rational relationship of this kind, that the plaintiff, the people who bring the case, are obligated to anticipate or guess about every single conceivable rational or reasonable reason that the government might have for making these distinctions between groups, and then to explain why they're not appropriate. So it's infinite. I mean, you can never anticipate all of them, and the argument that we made is that requirement was intended not at the very beginning of the case, which is where we were, even though the case was in the courts for a while. That it's after the case has been in the courts for a while, you've had a chance to learn more through discovery about what the government's thinking is, and you have a pretty good idea of the rationale and the reasons that they have for it, and then you can knock those down, when you make your argument. But you don't know any of that at the very outset of the case, and we said it didn't make sense to apply that requirement at the beginning of the case, which is where we were. And the court concluded no, it applies at any stage of the case, even at the beginning. And because we did not guess about the unlimited number of possible reasons that they might have for making this distinction, we failed, and so the case was dismissed.
Wow.
Can I ask you a question? How does that make you feel?
Yeah.
But look at Rahul.
Yeah. Well, I'm the wrong person to ask, because I've been knocked around a lot in my career, and I frequently say that when I was a new lawyer, I was afraid to go to court because I was afraid that I would take a good case in and mess it up. Now that I'm an old lawyer, I'm afraid to go to court because I think that I'm going to take a good case in and the judge is going to mess it up. So it's no longer a surprise to me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, how were you able to maintain your composure at that point? I mean, I would be flabbergasted, I guess, hearing that kind of really convoluted logic right there.
Well, I mean, you just have to sort of keep it in context and understand what's going on. And I can't know what the judges
Right.
were thinking, but it's not difficult for me to imagine that if you are in their position, removed from
Right.
the everyday lives and experiences of the people of Detroit, and what you have heard and what you've read is a story, a narrative of how the city of Detroit is on the rebound, that it's coming back, that it was in trouble, with respect to the bankruptcy, and now it's coming back, and there are efforts being made to do that. that it's not so hard for someone who's removed from that reality, from the realities of Detroit, to say, well, I'm not going to get in the way. That that there are things that are going on to cause the city to come back, and I'm going to put my faith in the government leaders and err on the side of caution, at least from my perspective, and say that they've got things under control. If they don't, they will. And so that's not too hard for me to imagine.
So it's been 5 years since then, right? I mean, at least since bankruptcy and the mass water shutouts that at least gained prominence around 2014, if not actually began then. To anyone who's lived in Detroit and has been following this, it just seems evident that, yeah, they're not getting a handle off this, that things are not getting better in so many ways. And even the practices of the DWSD are not particularly better compared to what they were before, because you still hear so many situations and examples of institutional just breakdown in lots of ways. Is there a way to bring this back or take this back to the legal bench, or is that door pretty much closed at this point?
No, we could start again. In fact, the judges offered unsolicited, gratuitous suggestions that we do that. but we already know how they feel about this now, and it wouldn't make practical sense to go back in and expecting a different result. I think that looking at this realistically, things are going exactly as planned. The idea is not to make life bearable for the poorest in Detroit. It is to make it unbearable. That's the whole point. This is a strategy, and then that's personal opinion.
Sure.
It's a strategy to drive out the unwanted population. The whole plan for this new Detroit is to bring in a new, more prosperous population, and there is no room for people who have very little, and it is very effective to drive them out by depriving them of water. So this is going pretty much as planned, and so it's like a steamroller. And trying to stop it is like standing in front of it and hoping that you can, through the strength of your biceps, stop a steamroller from crushing you.
How did your plaintiffs react when this verdict was handed down?
I think so many of them have been through so much, and I think if anyone is grounded in reality, it is them. And I don't think that they were particularly surprised by it. They took pleasure in small victories during the course of the case. We, in addition to asking for the ultimate remedies that we sought, also at the time of filing, asked for a preliminary injunction, which meant that before the case was even fully resolved, that because there was so much at stake, that the court should enter an order basically imposing a moratorium on water shutoffs until all of this had been sorted out. Before the court was going to rule on that, they conducted a full hearing, an evidentiary hearing where witnesses were allowed to come in and to testify and to tell their stories about what was happening, and experts came in and that kind of thing. Our clients regarded that as a victory. It was for some of them the first time that they had been able to actually tell their story in a place where people were going to actually listen. And so, to answer your question, I don't think many of them were surprised or shocked by the outcome.
There's something depressing in that as well.
Yeah, America is depressing. I mean, it by design. I mean, it promises much, and for the least among us, it delivers little.
Can I ask you about your preparation, I guess, for this for this litigation? Like, how many plaintiffs did you have, and what kind of data did you gather? What kind of data were you able to present? Just so we can talk really about the strength of the claims that you were making.
Yeah. I don't recall a precise number of clients. You know, if I had to guess, it was in the area of about maybe 8 to 12. But we filed it as a class action, which means that it was filed on behalf of all people who were threatened with water shutoffs. The individuals who were actual warm bodies that were participating in the case are regarded by the court as class representatives. You have to qualify as a class representative. You have to be able to demonstrate that you are very representative. Your circumstances are representative of the people who you purportedly are speaking for. So while we did not personally consult with everybody who was having their water shut off, we were able, through investigation and inquiry, to determine that what was happening was pretty typical of what would happen to these individuals who were class representatives was pretty typical of what was happening to the broad mass of people.
Were they residents of any particular part of the city, or across east, west, southwest, different parts?
The effort was, I don't know, don't recall specifically about geography, but the effort was made to get a diverse group of class representatives, people whose circumstances differed, but which at the same time were representative of a lot of people who went through the same kinds of things that they were going through.